Here we are. It's the end of the first quarter of the 21st century, and we don't seem to have learnt much, but that's the great thing. Now currently we're witnessing the so-called triumph of capitalism. Capitalism is basically private investment for private profit. That's its essential mission statement. There's no profit, there's no business, there's no corporation. There's no room for non-profitable businesses in a capitalist network. So over the past 50 years, we've seen the deregulation, privatisation, globalisation and corporatisation steamroller gather speed. So, has it really changed lives? Now, I'm not familiar with the rest of the world, I don't pretend I am, but I do take an interest in what happens around me, especially in this country, Australia. I'm very interested in what's happened over the decades, and I'm old enough to actually have seen the consequences of this philosophy, which is basically keep the government out of the way of the private sector. Keep the government out of the way of the private sector. Give the private sector its head and it will resolve the problems of society. Remove the regulations which restrict it from increasing its profits, irrespective of the human, social and environmental costs, and we get on with life. So what have we seen? What have we learnt in the last 50 years? We may have more material goods. Well, we do have more material goods, but we have more debt. Today, Australian society is basically divided into four classes. The 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, who've grown incredibly rich as a result of the giving away of the public assets to the private sector, laughingly called privatisation. We have seen the corporatisation of business and business networks around the country. Walk into any major shopping centre and you'll see the same brands over and over again, and many of those brands belong to one company. You may have 10, 20, 30 brands within a shopping centre which belong to the same company, which you're not aware of. We've seen the demise of small business. We've seen the increasing debt which people are faced with. As we see private interests based on a private investment for private profit model take over essential services. Now, public services were instituted during the 20th century, especially the latter half of the 20th century, because of the struggle of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people demanding the state intervene and provide them with essential services. Apart from Medicare, which has been starved of funds now for over 2 decades, what we've seen is more and more public facilities fall into private hands. Royal Commission after Royal Commission after Royal Commission has highlighted when you remove competition from society. When you privatise a particular asset or a particular service and you have no regulation to prevent dominant groups monopolising that service, then you get the situation we find ourselves today. Where although you may have laws which theoretically protect consumers, and you have organisations which are set up to protect consumers by governments, these organisations don't have, one, the parliamentary approval they need, that's the laws they need to do their job, and two, even more importantly, they don't actually have the services. They don't actually have the resources to do their jobs. And time again, we see the failure of these overseen organisations which are set up by government, which are set up to appease public sentiment when an essential service is privatised. Look at energy, aged care, early childhood development, infrastructure, toll roads, the privatisation of the ports, the airports, the privatisation of essential infrastructure, and most importantly of all, the privatisation of increasingly large segments of what is laughingly called the public service, where in some departments over 50% of employees are actually provided by the private sector, where you've got the ridiculous situation where you've got employees from the private sector which oversee that same sector. Extraordinary situation. That's the triumph of capitalism. Of course it's triumphed. It's triumphed by destroying the institutions which have been created to protect the individual from the arbitrary exercise, not only state power, but the arbitrary exercise of corporate power. Housing prices have escalated because there is no competition in the housing sector. It's not a matter of supply and demand. It's a matter of competition. If you had a strong public housing sector, housing prices would not have skyrocketed. And people wouldn't be spending 20, 30, 40, 50, 60% of their income paying rent or trying to repay a mortgage. That's happened because of the privatisation of the real estate, and that's occurred because of the destruction of the public housing sector and the privatisation by stealth of the public housing sector by organisations which call themselves, community housing, affordable housing, social housing, and the list goes on and on. Ultimately, they're just another private organisation trying to make a buck. Irrespective of whether they're profit or not for profit, when they make a profit, they reinvest it back in the business if it's not for profit. We see the dismal state of the aged care sector, when you've got the money and the resources, you can have a great retirement. But if you've worked in an ordinary job all your life and you've relied on superannuation, you find at the end of your working life there's never enough money to meet your needs, which increase with ageing. Whether they're healthcare needs, whether they're needs based on fragility. So is this the triumph we've been waiting for? Is this the light on the hill? Is this what we have been struggling for all these years? To allow a shrinking handful of individuals to own and control corporations which provide basic infrastructure and basic services to tens of millions of people, which use people's data to enrich themselves at the expense of the community. Have we now reached a situation where national sovereign nation states are nothing more than entities which give out contracts to the private sector to provide services which traditionally have been carried out by the public sector? If you go into any government department, it's not about the services they provide, it's about the contracts they give out to the private sector. And nothing highlights this more than the social security sector, where you have religious-based organisations and non-religious-based charities which have been given billions of dollars of public money to provide services that are required by the community. And this happens year in and year out, decade in and decade out. So what happens when you add a third tier? You've got a community, you've got a parliament, you've got a state parliament, a federal parliament, municipal councils. What happens when you give out a contract? What happens is that the services which people received are reduced because a significant proportion of that contract is used to create profits for those private companies. This is the triumph of capitalism. It has triumphed. It has triumphed in terms of maximising profits at the expense of everyone, or a great proportion of the community. About 9 to 10% of the Australian community are doing very well. And these are people who have disposable income after they meet their basic needs. And this disposable income, they're encouraged to invest this disposable income into property because of taxation laws which actually benefit people, give them a tax advantage in investing in housing. The more houses you own, the greater your tax advantage. If you invest in shares, you have a tax advantage. If you work 40 hours a week, you have no tax advantage. The reality is that capitalism has triumphed because it has done one very important thing. It has been able to hijack Parliament in front of our very eyes. It has been able to play the three-card trick in front of our very eyes and steal what is ultimately, in a representative democracy, we are responsible for this state of affairs. Because our parliamentary representatives have no fear of the electorate. We have a system where people are elected for 3 to 4 years, and during that time, unless there is major civil unrest, they continue to rule. And the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication understand that they are able to change the narrative by their control of not just the legacy media, but so-called social media. They are actually able to influence people on a mass scale, not on a daily, but instantly. And that's why we see around the world, as far as parliamentary democracies are concerned, we are seeing people looking towards so-called strong leaders to solve their problems. They think that somehow, that if you elect a billionaire criminal as President of the United States, that somehow things will improve for you. Ultimately, it's about private investment for private profit. And we will continue to find ourselves in this situation. So who are the 90% I'm talking about? I'm not talking about the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. I'm not talking about the 9% that have disposable income and are able to use this country's friendly taxation laws to enrich themselves. I'm talking about the great bulk of people who are wage earners or small business owners who at the end of the week may have enough disposable income for a holiday once or twice a year, but have nothing else apart from so-called superannuation. And the fact is that with super, the greater your wage, the greater the amount of money is put forward for your retirement, so you can have a great retirement. So going back, that great bulk of 60% of people who find themselves in this situation, who are able to acquire the latest car, the latest technology, they can actually buy things on the never, finding themselves hostages, financial hostages to a financial sector that uses money as uses money as handcuffs. It handcuffs us to the system. Because we don't pay back those resources to those financial institutions, we lose everything. So we find ourselves working 30, 40, 50 years to keep a roof over our heads, to pay the rent, to pay the mortgage, to send the kids to school, to have a holiday. But at the end of the day, there's nothing left. That's what's happening. And this happens and nothing changes because, as I said before, we have allowed this to occur. Parliamentarians fear the 1% that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication more than they fear the people they represent. They know that people who are up to their neck in debt will not rebel. They know if they pass legislation which doesn't interfere with the creation of ever-increasing profits for this shrinking minority, that they will get the support of those media moguls for the next election. They know that if they do not follow the script that is put before them in terms of the legislation which goes through Parliament, then they will suffer at the next election and lose any chance of being re-elected. And that's the way the power of Parliament has been usurped. We don't live in a sovereign nation state. We live in a corporate state where the needs of corporations are put before the needs of the people in this country, especially the 30% of Australians who rely on social security benefits to survive, who lead a hand-to-mouth, week-by-week existence. So this is the triumph of capitalism, handcuffing us to the financial sector, drowning us in debt, increasing anxiety in the community, increasing mental illness, increasing stress, creating situations which make it more and more difficult to be autonomous, to rule yourself, to have financial stability. This is the triumph of capitalism. Capitalism has triumphed as an ideology, and that's all it is. It's not an economic philosophy, it's an ideology. It's triumphed as an ideology because we have believed as a people that the best way forward is to allow the private sector to do what it likes. And what happens when that occurs is you create corporations who then dominate every aspect of our existence. So week after week we pay that price. That is the triumph of capitalism. And as we head into the next 25 years, I think it's important that people actually begin to understand the situation they find themselves in. And ultimately, change will only come when people see beyond the facade. They look behind the images, the social media images, they look behind those images and see the situation they find themselves in. And if we don't do that as a people, we will continue to be hostages to a corporate sector which is all powerful. It is so powerful that most sovereign nation states have no answer to the power it is able to exercise, because we have allowed this to occur, because we have believed the propaganda and the myths that giving private investors a clear runway will benefit all of us through a trickle-down economics. It's not trickle-down economics, it's trickle-down economics, T-R-E-A-C-L-E. The profits and the good times remain in the hands of those corporate giants. No wonder we see people with salaries of 5 million, 10 million, 15 million. No wonder we see the growth of the billionaire sector. No wonder we see increasing homelessness, increased anxiety amongst the very young and the very old. This is the triumph of capitalism, to create a society which is divided, a society which is divided on the basis of race and gender, sexual orientation, culture, language, religion. A society that's not willing to look at the reality that we face. So my message to you is to look around, see what's happening, join the dots, and if you can, join public interest before corporate interest. You can do it today on the net. Just go to pibci.net, pibci, you can join today. Ultimately, it's people like us coming together, exposing the weaknesses of the system that will act as the catalyst for change and destroy the illusion and the so-called triumph of capitalism.